I think your background too. You've got some startup type background, early stage. You were the chief of staff at the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Did I say that right?
Long acronym, yeah, DCEO.
Okay. So obviously, not only the startup background, but the corporate experience too. So again, thanks for joining us today. I just kind of want to set the stage, guys. I think right now this is a very sought after topic, just communications as a whole, and making sure that we as adults and effective leaders and business owners are communicating effectively, both again internally and externally. So I want to just kind of start out with a very elementary definition, of what is strategic communications to you, Andrew, and what are some of the things that you're seeing right now?
Yeah, I think strategic communications really comes down to how are you coordinating a consistent and concise message across all of your stakeholders. So what is the overarching strategy? What are the key messages, and how are you delivering those across what channels, what avenues to the stakeholders to meet their expectations on where they're going to hear it and what they're going to hear from you? Obviously COVID-19 has, in a lot of ways, dramatically changed the communications landscape, but the basic expectation, the basic strategy is still a consistent one, which is your goal is to meet the expectations of your stakeholders in what you're saying and how you're saying it, and sort of meeting them where they're having their conversation.
Interesting. So what are some of the things that you're seeing right now? I mean, you work with companies of all sizes. I'm assuming some of them are reaching out to you for, all sorts of even maybe crisis management situations, right? What are some of the things that are becoming the new norm for you?
I think the biggest thing that we're seeing from our clients and more broadly just across brands and companies is how to deal with uncertainty. There's always a certain amount of uncertainty built into running business, and what's the economy going to do? What are people's preferences going to be? Are your customers going to find another option for your product or your service? But the just true uncertainty right now is the biggest factor that I think companies and brands are having to deal with. And that uncertainty comes with they don't know when it's going to end. And I think that's probably the hardest part, is you don't have a clear picture of what the end of this looks like, either in a timeline or what that means. If we start to get the economy reopening in some sort of a stair-step fashion, when does your particular company fall into the now it's okay to be open? But more than that, even, if it's a Friday and your company is still directed to be closed by a governmental mandate or recommendation, and then all of a sudden that subsequent Monday it's okay to be open, are your employees, are your customers, are your clients going to be ready and comfortable coming back? What sort of new normal, as everyone's talking about, are you going to have to be contemplating for part of reopening? And all of that uncertainty makes it really hard to plan and communicate, because those are all questions that you're going to get as soon as you start to communicate with your stakeholders. And in many cases, you're not going to have clear answers at the time that you want to start communicating again.
So it's really interesting that you say, stakeholders, obviously there's the customer that we have to be communicating, but when you're talking about dealing with the uncertainty, what other major messages are you putting out, and also to who, right? I think that's the big one. Is it a consistent message that you're seeing externally versus internally and such with some of the companies that you work with?
I mean, there's certainly some common themes. We're all in this together, obviously, is one both internal and external, and sort of taking that and making it applicable to your brand or the expectations that people have of your brand. How can you still be true to that brand in this new reality? I think another theme is obviously trying to balance the way that you talk about how you're serving your employees. And that's both an internal and an external message. Highlighting, for instance, what leadership is doing with salary or bonuses or furloughs compared to what the frontline employees might be. Those very direct and sort of increase in transparency in many cases. Information on the state of the business, the financials, the decisions that are having to be balanced. Definitely see that as a common theme across most companies. And then trying to strike the right balance of where there's a pivot in a company to provide a needed resource, or if they're an essential business, how are you communicating internally and externally for we're in an essential business that's important for us, but also the safety and health of our employees is important. And here's how we're ensuring that we can appropriately balance employee safety on the work site while still getting an essential service or product out into the market for the people that need it.
I think I would know your answer to this, but I mean, it might be all of it, but what is the most important thing that we should be putting out right now? Is it to our customers? Is it to our teams? Would you recommend a little bit of both? And what's the message that, is the most common theme that you're hearing?
It's a great question. And I think it's one that everyone is asking, and there's not a straightforward answer other than a little bit of all of it, which is not a super clear answer, but you absolutely need to maintain ongoing and continued conversations with your employees, your internal stakeholders, as well as your external stakeholders, whether it's customers or the public at large. And I think the message, has to be in the realm of here's where we are, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and we're going to be honest and transparent about what we don't know. And depending on how this goes, here's the things that we may have to continue trying to do, or the types of difficult decisions that we're going to have to make. So I think it's, there's always going to be a bias for transparency and communications, but I think COVID-19 has increased the level of detail that you are transparent about in a way that maybe before you wouldn't have had to go quite as deep into the realities or the difficult decisions and really the trade-offs that you use when you're making a decision. Yeah.
A lot of businesses are making some really tough calls right now. What do you think is most important for those that are going to have to do layoffs if they haven't already, or furloughs? And is that a message internally and externally to the public, or is it just to their shareholders?
I think if you're making any of those difficult decisions, you really do need to think about a fairly comprehensive communications plan. Anything that's going to involve salary, benefits, layoffs, you obviously want to ensure that internal message gets out before your employees are going to hear it from some other source. You would hate for your employee to read something online in a blog, to hear it on a news broadcast before they've been told directly about something that's going to impact them. So the importance is even more important right now, that those internal communications are sequenced appropriately before your internal audiences can be surprised by something. And I think the core message there has to be a version of we're all in this together and we're leading from the top. So the companies that have had to do furloughs, most of them start that message out with some version of here's what's happened at the CEO level, here's what's happened at the board level, here are the things we're doing to maximize the resources that are available to our frontline employees. I think another really important one is to answer the question of what that means for benefits, and in particular health benefits, even if they're furloughed or laid off. A lot of companies will make a very explicit point of trying to either provide some extension of coverage if you're laid off, or for furloughed employees. There are quite a few that have done not just continuing their healthcare benefits, but providing and covering the employee premiums, in which case now you may be furloughed, but the company is in effect paying 100% of your healthcare costs. And that's a way of demonstrating you're trying to be creative and really focused on the impact of the employees while still having to make these really difficult decisions.
Yeah. I can't help but wonder, and I think I know the answer because we had talked about this once, but if there's some type of a process, right, when you talk about this communication, and you and I talked about it, I think back in November, like I can't remember the exact terminology, but it was some sort of a structured
Yeah.
communication process that you tell them what they want to know, you tell them, right? Obviously, key stakeholders to deal with on all sides. So, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I think what you're probably talking about is the idea of having an established crisis communications playbook or plan. A lot of interchangeable words, but basically it's your playbook to determine how you're going to communicate in any given scenario. What are your stakeholders? Who owns those relationships? What is the order in which you want to go out to those stakeholders? And what is some of the sequencing for follow-up and subsequent communications, again, depending on the scenario. So, a lot of companies have established communications playbooks. They may have had a particular section that talked about a pandemic or that talked about other sort of force majeure things that are a little outside of business control, bad weather. In some places that, they would have a scenario that talks about civil unrest. But most of them probably didn't go deep enough into how are we going to combine not just the crisis communications plan, but then our continuation of operations or our business continuity plan. So the operations side, now that everyone's had to move remotely and work from home, the challenges of doing the communications while also getting the operations to match that, I think is one that a lot of people will take another look at as they're able to sort of come out from the real impact of COVID-19 and have a little time to go back and do a bit of a reassess or a evaluation of how this went. If you don't have a crisis plan or a playbook, I definitely think this would be the time to think about doing that. And it's not just for a pandemic. This is for, it could be, a material financial issue, a merger and acquisition, an IPO. This could be significant leadership change. This could be a product launch or a product failure. A lot of times these playbooks will look at things like a product recall. And the whole point is you want to have this structure in place so you don't have to think so much about what is my sequencing, what's my checklist, and you've gotten some amount of your communications, or at least the core foundation parts of it, pre-approved, so you don't have to get stuck in this limbo of waiting for too many people to weigh in on something, and you're able to get out there, you're able to plant your flag of what the narrative should be before someone else is trying to define it for you.
It's a great point. And I think just you and I have talked about it's building the trust, credibility, while still, having empathy, I suppose, in the messaging, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The whole point, I mean, the value of the playbook, again, is that it gives you some of that rigor to remember and understand some of the nuances if your stakeholders have a particular place that they are most often to be receiving or consuming the content that you want them to have, if there are particular priorities of people within your stakeholder group that need to hear it before others. Again, that sequencing really sometimes can feel like it should be fairly straightforward, but as you start to put it down on paper, you're going to start to see some of these interconnections where it's really important for this stakeholder to hear something before this one because of some other connection or some other impact that they may have on each other, as well as just making sure you're not missing any. And that is really what builds the trust then, is that you get that extra moment, that extra benefit of the doubt that people believe what you're saying, they believe you're transparent, they trust that you're taking the best action you can, even if it's a very difficult decision you're communicating.
Yeah. So on the flip side, there's so much negativity right now out there about this, and we're all going through it together, as you said, in the beginning of this Zoom meeting. But what if you want to communicate a good message? Someone on our team said, you don't want to appear to be tone deaf during this time, right? Have you had anyone that wants to communicate good news through COVID, and how have they done so, or maybe an example?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's The best advice is that it's really, you're walking a very fine line, I guess is what I would say. And again, I'm not trying to dance around the question. It's hard to give blanket guidance here because good news is going to be relative in a new way right now. If it's good news about a new product launch, if there's some way to tie that into a way that it can enable, let's just talk about Zoom since we're on that, right? If they had some other product or service that was going to increase the way that we are able to communicate with each other, that somehow would improve company culture while we're not able to be around each other in person, like you can make that story, you can tell that story in a tangible way that connects it to the realities we're in right now. Short of it having a real impact on the realities now of making some difference in the sort of day-to-day COVID-19 life that we all are in right now. If it's a new product coming up, talk about how this is, we're really excited about this because this is going to be how we're going to bring back people that maybe had to be furloughed. Like we believe so strongly in our future path and the course that we've set that this is going to allow us to grow whenever we're all able to come back and be together and make this launch happen. So putting in a little of the context is going to be important. I don't think in any way you should say you should not make positive news. Obviously, people are starved for it. I mean, you look at what John Krasinski is doing with Some Good News. Like that's taken off because people are desperate to hear good, happy, uplifting stories right now. It's just a matter of putting it in context and being sympathetic to what might be the impact to folks that aren't able to be quite as positive in this moment as you're trying to be.
Yeah. What about the communication to your customers, right? What do they want to hear? How do you use empathy with them and still instill their trust for your brand during these hard times, and/or how do you relate, right?
I think the relating part is just remember that they're also running a business, and being considerate to where in the supply chain you are relative to each other. Are you dependent on that customer for your business? Is that customer dependent on you for their business surviving? And just being aware of the decisions that you're making, how that will trickle down and impact others in your customer base. Being transparent, being open with them. Again, it may seem somewhat straightforward, but the more that you can pick up the phone or dial into a Zoom meeting and just have those conversations, even if you can't be face to face, and say, look, here's what we're going through. This is the decision we are having to make. Here's a couple of options. We want to work with you on the solution that is least impactful to both of us together. But our commitment is that we also want to be there together at the end of this. And so putting it in that sort of sequencing of let's work on this, let's find the solution that we can agree is the least bad option if it has to be a bad option, but with a commitment to each other that we want to come out the other side and build on the fact that we're now, we've built an even stronger trust relationship.
So what about on the flip side with the investors? I mean, have obviously some of the larger companies that you work with probably have or publicly traded maybe, but even the small private ones, and I think for any of the business owners on this call, I mean, we're all wondering the same things, like how do we communicate with those investors, right? I mean, they all know that we're going through this. I've read tons of VC reports that, they expect a downturn for the next 6 to 18 months. Some VCs are more optimistic than others. They're talking about, deploying, I think I saw the number like 62% will still deploy capital on a recent survey. So people are still taking meetings and they know the current state of the situation. But if we've already, just as an example, if we were to take on money on a cap raise to, outside VCs or private investors, or maybe we've got a long list of, shareholders on our cap table, how are you seeing companies communicating with those investors?
No, I would say I'll answer it a slightly different way, only because I think one thing we've definitely seen in investor communications that you didn't mention, but is also sort of very timely, is how you're talking to those investors, but also then how the communication that's separate from investors to your other stakeholders, is impacted by whether you are or aren't going after any of the programs that are available federally or state-based programs for assistance. What is the trade-off? As we've seen with the Paycheck Protection Plan, some of the larger companies that have accessed or gotten these loans, the investors are probably like, you should absolutely go after this. It's, in effect, almost free money. Why would you not go after this instead of taking on additional debt somewhere? Whereas the brand reputational side, maybe a different communication about, should you as a bigger company be accessing this when the quote unquote mom and pop shop isn't able to access a loan in the same way? So I think it's interesting that the investors have a much clearer message that hasn't changed a lot. It's still all about, what is the financial picture? I think helping maybe explain the longer term brand and reputation impacts and how there is a fiscal component to that is something that's good to weave into investor communications right now, especially when it comes to determining how and if you're going to be accessing the programs that are available from the public sector.
Yeah, completely agreed. And that thing is all over the board right now, right? I think that's a big topic, the PPP. We talked about that on another session. And obviously a lot of the money got allocated to even publicly traded companies. So not sure how that happened, but it's a big topic right now. I think I want to respect everyone's time and get some Q&A in here. So if we are taking questions on Twitter at fundconference.com. We'll come back to that in just a second, but we are queuing those up. So any questions, hit us up on Twitter. We'll get to those here in just a second. I think from my curiosity, I'm wondering, who have you seen is like a great example of communications during this time? And alternatively, who has been a horrible example or a very bad example of communications during this time? I think it'll just help put it in perspective.
I'll tell you one that absolutely stands out for me still, both because it was so early in, this would have been, it was right around St. Patty's Day. So very, very early in this process. But Guinness had a really good ad, I thought, that they put up very quickly for St. Patrick's Day. And it was the right tone. It was still positive and forward looking, but it was also like, we're in this together and don't do anything that will put you at risk. If you have a chance to go back and look at the ad that they had up, it was on TV for sure. And I probably was some online digital component to it as well. But it was incredibly well done, I thought. It struck exactly the right balance. It remained positive while being sympathetic to the realities of what we were going through, and that really we were just starting to see the initial impacts of it. So that one continues to stick out for me. A more recent one, I want to say it was Kraft Heinz has one that was maybe up in the last couple of days here. You've probably also seen in the last day, someone has a pretty good video. It's a couple-minute video that just shows every we're in this together COVID-19 ad sort of spliced in with each other, and they all basically follow the same formula. The interesting thing with the Kraft one, at least, why it sort of stands out a little bit as a positive example, is it's presented directly in the voice of the employees. So it never, it just has a different tone and feel to it, which I thought was a pretty positive one. Another one that I think has been good about, an interesting way to continue to stay true to a brand and what people expect from the brand. I'm also biased because it's one of my favorite companies, but REI, they've obviously had opt-out side as this incredibly powerful campaign for the last few years. The whole idea obviously is getting people outside, and right now you're not supposed to, really. You're supposed to stay as close as you can to your home and limit your movement. And what they've done on the REI Journal, like their blog online, is a really great job of staying true to what people like and think about with REI, the experience of being outdoors, but putting it in context for what's okay now. So how can you get in shape now for that backpacking trip of a lifetime that you want to take? Here's some tips for at-home yoga or something like that. Or what can you do now that you actually have the time to fix the gear that you've always thought about fixing but never gotten around to doing? So they've pivoted the types of communications they have to put it in the right context for the moment that we're in. Those are a few that definitely stand out for me as positive. I think I'll plead the fifth on any that are not going as well for right now.
Airlines, hotels, all the above.
I mean, I think they're trying. Hospitality in particular, hospitality and travel, it's had such a dramatic impact with a real hard, future growth to predict. Like, what is this going to look like? Is it, country by country, month by month? That makes it really hard to build much of a model for when things will get back to normal. I do think the travel companies and I want to say Marriott may have been among the first to do this, to really clearly talk about through the lens of how are we doing something as a company for your benefit, our loyalty members. When they put out a note from the CEO on changes to redemption, so people's points aren't going to expire, to how they're going to make it easier to get or maintain certain loyalty tiers. I think that really was a good move by the hospitality travel industry. And I want to say Marriott was among the first to do that. I remember getting the email from them and thinking it was incredibly well done.
It's creative too, right? It's like, it's forward thinking about their customer without having to have their customer ask them for it.
Yeah.
And it's probably like the click of a button for them, right? Like, I mean, it may or may not cost them anything, but the long-term gain is the lifetime value of the customer, right?
Yeah. Anytime you can make some of those consumer or customer centric decisions before it appears or is real that you're being forced to do them, that's where you get the brand equity. You build up the trust and the reputation credits that you want and can then call on in the future when you need them.
Yeah. One more question from me, and then we're going to go to the audience. Again, it's at fundconference.com on Twitter for any questions. Victoria on our end is monitoring those. We'll be asking them here in just a minute. I'm actually just curious, one last thing. How many companies have crisis management tools in place and or even have playbooks? And how many would we be surprised if we knew the number?
I think more than a number, I think you'd probably be surprised with some well-known names and large significant sized companies that just don't have that process or that program in place. I'd give it rough numbers, sort of making this up to a certain extent, but let's say a third of them have really well developed, well thought out programs that are appropriately staffed and regularly trained against and sort of updated annually. A third of them have given it some thought, have done something in the past, but don't keep it current, don't update it, don't train people on it. And then a third of them just haven't done anything on it. And completely understandably, a lot of those are ones that have limited resources, and this just becomes something that's hard to dedicate some of those limited resources to. But I think the value you get from having some of this structure and planning in place in advance more than pays for any of the resources that you may have to dedicate to it early on.
Yeah. And can you just give us, before we go to Q&A, maybe 15, 20 seconds on your role, where you're at, where you service, who you service, and Reputation Partners, and then we'll go into Q&A.
Yeah, thanks. So Reputation Partners is a strategic communications firm. We're headquartered here in Chicago. We have an office in Milwaukee. Our whole premise is around building and protecting brands for our clients. So the services we offer all sort of build to that core foundational purpose. We do crisis communications, crisis planning. We do investor financial communications, do a lot of digital services, thought leadership, executive positioning. Of course, we also have a very strong section of our work that's dedicated to true sort of, straight PR, media relations, whether that's pitching, developing relationships, working on longer form content. So try to offer a little bit of everything under that sort of broad umbrella of strategic communications. We've clients, predominantly in the upper Midwest, but clients coast to coast and a few international as well. And always happy to help if someone has any questions. Can always feel free to reach out. I'm at andrew@reputationpartners.com.
Awesome. I just heard from Victoria. We don't have any questions, so you must have answered everyone's questions while we were on here.
Let's go with that for sure.
So over communication, I mean, any other points that you would have before, we were to sign off?
No, I would say, we're getting to a point where maybe we can't quite predict what the light at the end of the tunnel is, but we know that things are going to start reopening. So now is absolutely the time to think about what are you going to say, and in what form and fashion are you going to say it to your stakeholders about the different levels of reopening? Is it, are you an essential service or not? If not, what does that mean for when people should start to work again? When do you actually welcome people back to work sites? Is it everyone that's coming back at once? Are you staggering that return in some form or fashion? If you are retail or customer facing, how and when are you going to reopen your stores to let people in? And what are the new realities of limiting the number of people in, or a change in the sanitization program that you may have in place there? How do you want to communicate those things so that people feel comfortable coming back into your stores or your locations? So I think planning and thinking through the different scenarios of how you are going to address the ability to sort of stagger a stepped up reopening program would be incredibly valuable right now. And just ensuring you have a full accounting of your stakeholders, who owns the relationships with them, and how are you going to get this clear, concise message out to them in the right order.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, obviously, very hot topic right now. Thank you again for joining us. Where can people find you, Andrew?
Yeah, we're reputationpartners.com. You can email me at andrew@reputationpartners.com, or can always give me a call too. Probably easiest though is email.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for your time. Thanks everybody for joining us. Again, tomorrow's session will be on pricing and economic models and rolling out new products and services and how to effectively do that with the right price. So check that out tomorrow at 1 p.m. You can sign up on fundconference.com. Thank you again, Andrew Moyer, Reputation Partners, for joining us today. And thank you guys for being on the call. We will send a follow-up link with the survey as well as the recording to this video. You guys have a great rest of the day. See ya.
Thanks, RJ. Take care.
Thanks.